Hello, everyone. Good morning or good evening, good afternoon, depending where you are in the world tuning in. I'm Mark Ledbury. I'm the Director of the Power Institute at the University of Sydney. And I'd first like to acknowledge that the campuses of the University of Sydney are on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, owners and custodians of the land on which many of the University of Sydney campuses are built. I pay my respects to all elders of the Gadigal, past, present and emerging, and I'd like to extend that respect to all our guests, our speakers, and all First Nations people in our audience. As I was saying, I'm the Director of the Power Institute, named for the experimental artist John Power, whose generosity led to the establishment not only of art history here at Sydney, but also of the idea that we should teach art, visual knowledge and visual communication beyond the campus and out in the world. And the Power Institute is a research and engagement-driven foundation of the University of Sydney. We collaborate across the world to bring publications, speakers and research projects together to ask big questions about vision, the world and art, if you like. And if you'd like to know more, please sign up for our newsletter at powerpublications.com.au or simply Google us. So this series, which I'm very excited about, is entitled Kāmawāpātahmōwin and focuses on Indigenous visual knowledge and its transmission and its continuing importance. And I'm going to let our guest convener, Professor Gerald McMaster, explain that term and many others. But before I hand over and introduce Gerald, Gerald will introduce the rest of the panel and today's particular topics. But I want to say that this series is a collaboration between Power and the Wapatah Centre for Indigenous Visual Knowledge. And I'd like to thank everyone there, particularly Natalia Chestapova and Brittany Bergin for their crucial help organising this series. And I'd especially like to thank our own Nick Croggan, Programmes and Events Coordinator here at Power, who's done so much to make these programmes, this particular programme happen. And I also just briefly will introduce Gerald, though many of you will be very familiar with him. Gerald McMaster, the Director of the Wapatah Centre for Indigenous Visual Knowledge at OCAD University in Toronto, and over at least 3 decades of work as an artist, curator and scholar. He's been profoundly influential on the fields of contemporary art, critical theory, museology, and Indigenous aesthetics and visual thought. He is a Plains Cree from the Red Pheasant Cree Nation and a member of the Siksika Nation. He has a special connection to Sydney, as many of you all know, having served as artistic director of the 2012 Biennale. And most exciting for us, he will be here again in July, here as the Terra Foundation Visiting Professor of First Nations Art. And I'd like to thank the Terra for their exciting and generous support of this initiative. The programme seeks to bring prominent First Nations scholars to Australia to teach and engage with our own Australian students and scholars. This programme has been long held up by the frustrations of the last few years of COVID. We're absolutely delighted that Gerald will be coming to Sydney in July. And in fact, the next 2 events in this series will be hosted by Gerald over here in Australia. So I'm delighted that that's going to be happening very soon. It's now my great pleasure to hand over to Gerald with thanks, and he's going to introduce the themes and the panelists for tonight's talk. So over to you, Gerald, and thanks again.
Thank you, Mark. Hello and good evening, everyone. Good morning, Australia. Thank you for being here on this beautiful spring day. If you're in Australia, it is the fall time already. It's the autumn. But let me first acknowledge all our relations, everyone and everything that's being affected at this moment by the terrifying forest fires here in Western Canada. All 3 of our guests here tonight are living in Western Canada, and they can attest to the smoke that is billowing across the skies, across the western part of Canada into their area. And of course, as many of you in Australia can also attest to the same catastrophe that you experienced just a short while ago. So I think together we can all share in our thoughts of those people and the animals and all life that is going through the current catastrophe. So this is the second in our series. So first of all, I wanted to shout out, give a great big thanks to Cristobal Martinez, Harold Gasky, and Professor Leroy Littlebear for the fantastic conversation in which they kicked off this series. They, of course, those of you who listened in, they laid the groundwork for the theoretical groundwork, I should say, for which they spoke about the empowering use of Indigenous languages to much of our practices. Tonight, I'm very delighted that we continue along this thread of addressing the epistemologies of perception or the Indigenous ways of seeing through the lens of Indigenous languages. All three of our guests here tonight come from various parts of Canada, and all three of them are fluent speakers of their ancestral languages. So without further ado, let me introduce each of them to you. So first of all, Krista Ulijuk-Zawadski. Hello, Krista. Krista is an Inuk anthropologist, researcher, independent curator, and a maker from Rankin Inlet in the far north of Nunavut. She is currently a PhD candidate at Carleton University in Ottawa. And like many young Indigenous scholars and curators, Krista is spending time examining cultural belongings in homes and in museums around the world as a catalyst to foster the engagement between Inuit knowledge holders and the younger generations. Her primary interests are Indigenous academic work and anthropology, museology, and collections-based research with an emphasis on fostering accessibility to collections for and by Inuit. Taking the same approach to art and art making, Krista uses Inuit belongings and art in a personal and museum collections to inspire her creative practice. So welcome, Krista. Next, Kae Stapi Mekio Tapi, if I pronounced that correctly, is riding a painted horse, who belongs to the aggressive People's Clan of the Siksika Nation of Alberta. We know him as Kent, a young man. Kent actively participates in Blackfoot societies and ceremonies, and at a young age, he was fortunate enough to have his late grandfather, Arthur A. Youngman Sr., who I actually knew, and he was encouraged by his grandfather to live the Siksika way of life. He is especially adept at making authentic Siksika clothing, accessories, and horse gear, and he is knowledgeable about the ancient designs and symbolism. And more importantly, he's very familiar with the protocol related to ownership and use of many of the cultural belongings. And like Krista, he has worked in museums all across the world. And finally, Kisaga Kofti is day traveler, or as we know him, Floyd Favo. Hello, Floyd. Danse. He is a theorist of theater. He's a director, teacher, and essayist. Floyd studied theater in Denmark at a school for Sami and Inuit peoples. And in Italy, he studied with the famed Jerzy Grotowski, who is the Polish theater director and one of the more influential directors and figures in the 20th century. Floyd is currently the curator of the Powmaker Museum, as well as the director of the International Powmaker Indigenous Performance Festival. His latest book of collected essays on theater methods and journalism, which he'll probably speak to us about this evening, was published just last year by the University of Silesia in Katowice, Poland. This is the first book published that articulates and outlines an indigenous theatrical methods. So welcome to all three of you. Okay, so those of you who are listening in tonight and want to ask questions, you have that opportunity to provide questions in the comments sections. And at the end of our conversation this evening, we should be able to get around to them, and hopefully we don't go over time. So there you have it. Okay, Krista. Welcome.
Hi.
So your PhD in Inuit clothing. So for most people who are, we were just talking before we got on with Nicholas and Mark about how cold it is in Sydney at the moment at plus 15 degrees. I thought this morning it was 0 degrees here, and where I'm living, I was curious why they were so cold. So, but of course, for Inuit and most Canadians who live in Canada certainly are probably unaware that Inuit have long known and understood how critically important clothing has been to be able to survive extreme cold. You know, when in the books that we read about the Kalunat, as you call them, or white people or Southerners who came to the Arctic hundreds of years ago, you know, all these stories where they talk about that most, if not all of them, froze to death, right? Until because they just didn't want to dress like Inuit. But so eventually they swallowed their pride and listened to the Inuit, and many of them survived. So that's an interesting thing. But now there's more research and development, of course, on traditional and historic Inuit clothing, especially in the last 50 years. And and from that research and what Inuit have always known, you know, this notion when we think of insulation, where two materials come together, in between there's a space that provides that kind of space between the cold and your body. So I think that is a very interesting part of the clothing. And that kind of technology, that knowledge that Inuit have always had. You know, there's a lot of companies today that are doing research and constantly doing research on clothing and what kind of materials can withstand the cold. So, but for you and for Inuit, traditional clothing still remains an important part of your way of life. And so there are certain materials I think that you prefer over the manufactured material. And because the clothing, traditional clothing, still makes an impact on sort of cultural values and knowledge, right? It keeps you alive, so that the clothing, and I want you to talk about this because clothing sustains and expresses Inuit identity. So could you tell us more, like from your dissertation? I know that your dissertation is an important part of the study, and what I want to get at through language, through just your study and how that's coming to be important. So if you could talk a bit about that for us.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for your introduction. I'm going to take a step back a little bit and then focus in on the clothing near the end of my comments. Well, you might be wondering, like, what is she talking about? But it all comes together. I think throughout my research, one of the things that I learned that has made the most impact on me as a researcher and a scholar is that how easy it actually is to take an Inuit approach in academia or an Indigenous approach in academia. Inuit research and Indigenous research methodologies fit really well within academia for a number of reasons. And one of them is that we are always doing research at home. For example, sewing, that is part of research. That is research. You're asking questions. How do I make this? Why is it made this way? Which is a better material? What stitch should I use? you know, those types of questions are definitely, you know, research questions. But maybe it doesn't necessarily look like what research is in academia. So that's one of the things, like I said, has made the most impact on me, is learning to step away from those colonial frameworks of research and really realizing that, hey, this is part of our lives, and this is how we do it. And I could do this in academia. And you know, sometimes research looks like you're standing in the line at the bank and you ask someone, do you know anything about needle cases? Or do you know how to make a bird bone needle? You know, sometimes that's what research looks like, because for an Inuk at home, that is how I would do my research. It's a natural path for me to conduct my research that way in academia. And that's exactly what I did, and how I learned to make bird bone needles was I asked community members, I asked my family, and we worked together, fiddling in the garage sort of thing, try this tool or try that technique until we figured it out. And can you show the photo of the beadwork and the computer? I don't know. Yeah, that one. The other thing that I've learned along the way is that, you know, and this is what I really appreciate, is that we take a really holistic approach. And I mean, in research, but also in everything, you know, clothing, sewing, hunting, making tools, all of these things come together in one way or another. So we can't really like separate things and look at them in, you know, look at it by itself. And I think that's really important here. And again, it ties to clothing as well. In my research, what I mean about taking a holistic approach is, you know, working with the community, working with my family, working with all of these materials and technologies. And I think that's what's been really, what helped make it really successful. My parents are part of my research. My kids are part of the research. My aunts and uncles, my brother-in-law, you know, all these family members and elders and community members. You know, one time my nephew helped me map a site. You know, that's great. You know, kids should be involved in all aspects of your work. And this is why I show this photo, is I'm sitting here at my aunt's house. There's my daughter in the background playing, and we have some fabric on the floor, the green fabric there, that we were going to use to cut out a pattern to sew together and make a new garment, adjusting the size and whatnot. And, you know, that's research, is learning how to do that kind of work. But here I'm at the same time, I'm looking at these archival photographs and asking people like my aunt or my grandma or other community members, what can you tell me about this archival material? Who are these people? Do you know them? Who are their families? You know, genealogy plays a big part in this kind of work, which ties again into this holistic approach. And for me, it's been a really meaningful experience to be able to do this kind of work with community and family. I think you can take it down now if you want. And then, you know, subjectivity is also an integral part of this research, because you have to be able to place yourself into it. You have to be able to know, you know, going back to sewing, you need to be able to know how to sew. How does it fit? You know, I wear a garment and I know how it fits, and therefore that influences how I sew or how I adjust the pattern so that it fits somebody else better. And can you show the other photo there? You know, another aspect of this, you know, going back to the clothing or focusing more on the clothing here, is what I've discovered through my research with clothing and bird bone needles and, you know, other Inuit technology, is that sewing designs, Inuit sewing designs and patterns they're works of like engineering. They're phenomenal. They're amazing. Everything fits together, and they fit together for a reason. Even when you look at a pattern and you think like there's a pattern on the floor there, and we're looking at it, trying to figure out how does this all fit together. It looks chaotic or too complex or confusing, but each piece and each angle and each cut has a purpose, and you have to trust that design, because these are designs that are, thousands of years in the making. And learning to sew these garments has really made me see clothing in a different way and have a deeper understanding of it. Like I said, the subjective aspect of it is like, I know how this garment is supposed to fit on me or fit on somebody else. And when I would do collections-based research, I do a lot of collections-based research, looking at garments and the patterns and taking measurements and drawing pictures and that sort of thing. I'm better able to engage with that cultural material because I have gained this knowledge firsthand through sewing and learning about the technology and the language. There's a lot of language that comes into play when it comes to sewing and sharing knowledge and teaching younger generations or even older generations. I had a student in one of my gatherings, sewing and beading gatherings here. Our oldest student was 84, and she said, "You're never too old to learn new things." And that was exciting and inspiring. So
you brought up the idea that language is so critical, and I think that would, to me, that was what attracted me to just kind of your thinking. And having known you for a number of years now, and realizing that language is an important part of your upbringing, because you were born and raised and socialized, obviously, in Rankin Inlet, where Inuit is largely spoken. In fact, probably the entire community speaks Inuit. And you mentioned earlier that your father is non-Inuit, but he does speak Inuit. So, and what for us, I think for this series of Indigenous Visual Knowledge, language plays a significant part of understanding the world, the worldview. And I'm wondering how language enters into that kind of discussion with the older ladies or even men, perhaps. But and looking at that architecture, just the complexity of what we're looking at, what we see on the floor, and how all the pieces fit together. And no doubt there's language plays a significant part to the pieces, to understanding the pieces, perhaps the technique. Could you think about that? Could you help us try to understand it? And so give us some examples of how language is important, right? How you use language in the communication of understanding this really interesting set of techniques.
yeah, definitely. Language is so important. If you know the language, then it helps you think in that way. If you know Inuktitut, then you think in an Inuk way. And I think that definitely helps shape the questions you ask and the conversations that you have. You can have deeper conversations because you don't have to worry about translations or things that get lost in translation. For example, part of my research, I'm listening to these archival recordings, and you can take the photo down if you want. And so part of the research that I'm doing, there's a researcher that was traveling in the Arctic in the early 1980s. And in one of the interviews, so she doesn't speak the language. During the interviews, she has a local translator with her all the time. And So I'm able to listen to the elders that she's interviewing. Most of them don't speak English, and I can understand what they're saying, and I could compare to what's actually translated. So sometimes there's a lot of things that are left out. So the researcher doesn't know that. But in one example is, and it stuck with me ever since I heard this recording, is she asks the elder, do you know about a man named Tasusi and Panti? And I'm thinking, those are not Inuit names. I've never heard Tasusi and Panti. I don't know where that comes from. And the Inuk man who doesn't speak English tells the translator, no, I don't know who those people are. And so the researcher says, well, okay, next question. But I realized in her questioning that she was talking about a person named Tasiok and Bauti, not Tasusi and Panti, Tasiok and Bauti. And if she had asked that, if she was able to pronounce it properly, and asked that question, she probably would have got a whole, complex, very comprehensive answer about who these people are, because they were, people knew who this couple was. They're part of this big family, and this guy that she was interviewing probably would have had stories to share, but there was an opportunity missed there. So, being a researcher and knowing the language is so important, for those reasons. You ask different questions, you have different conversations, and you're able to understand what people are saying. The other thing that that's important about language and research is that I've realized that in a lot of this research that I'm doing with archival material is that it's really hard to find people, because I'm doing a lot of genealogical work at the same time. Like I said, this holistic approach. So there's sewing and technology and archival research and genealogy and all these things mixed together. But it's really hard to find people in the archives because they're really misspelled. And, like how the researcher had mispronounced them. So then obviously people have misspelled names in the past. And it's always interesting when you come across something and you're like, oh, actually, this is so-and-so, this is not right. And I think that, that's one aspect of why knowing the language is so important. The other thing, talking about sewing, is there's so many words in Inuktitut that have to do with sewing, like the names of certain pieces or even stitches. Like the stitches have their own names. So when you're learning something, especially from someone that maybe doesn't speak English or only speaks Inuktitut, you're better able to understand when they're giving you instruction, like you have to sew it this way and you do this stitch. And so they use like amukatak is the stitch. You have to remember to use that. So then in the future, I have to use amukatak when I do this garment, And so there's that like knowledge retention that is really emphasized through the language. And yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm losing my train of thought.
Yeah, no, I wanted to just pick it a little bit. You mentioned, and I experience this too when I go to visit museums around the world, and often the curators are asking me, is this right? Is this correct? Is this the proper word? Or what's the correct name for this? So, and then actually more and more curators now are asking Indigenous folks, right? Perhaps more than knowledge, because what exists there is older knowledge, but sometimes, as you say, it could be misinterpreted. So having contemporary Inuit or other First Nations, for example, to help the curators give them at least something to go on, something that they know, right? To correct it maybe, to add a bit more knowledge, because it really greatly increases that that understanding. And so I'm assuming you do the same thing when you travel, that you're asked those kind of questions.
Yeah, definitely. I think, and going back to like collections research, when you search a database, I often have to revert to the misspellings, like kayak. I think everyone knows what a kayak is, but it's actually kayak. So when I want to search in the collection for a kayak, which is Q-A-J-A-Q, I have to spell it K-A-Y-A-K, and that, that irks me a little bit sometimes. But I think it's important to do that kind of work, especially in collections, using proper terminology and proper names, because if you go into a collection with like an elder who doesn't speak English, and then again, you search the database for something, like I didn't know what in my language a kakivak is in English. I only learned this a few years ago. It's called a leister, for fishing.
Okay.
I would have, if I had gone to the database, I would have never known to search for leister. I don't know that word. I only know it as kakivak. So having those words and names in collections, in databases and files is really important, because then Indigenous people are better able to navigate the collection that way. And I think that it makes a huge difference. Like the Winnipeg Art Gallery, who have the largest Inuit art collection in the world, they've been working really hard to make their database really accessible. They have syllabics in there. So they have, if there's a name on a carving, for example, at the bottom, if it's spelled in syllabics, they put it into the database. So then they could compare if they need to find another name, but from the same name, it's more easily accessible. But they're also inserting all of the proper Inuktitut terms and names for different art pieces or different subject themes and that sort of thing. So I think that's I love seeing that when museums are doing that kind of work, and curators.
Yes, and museums are now accessible from the outside, from a distance, great distance like you are. And they're very open, or at least a number of them are starting to be much more open to that kind of Indigenous knowledge. And I'm glad you're participating in it. So I'm going to come back to you because I think that point that you're getting on the substance of language and interpreting words and phrases, how that gets confused or mixed up when you do it into another language, we lose that poeticness of the language. And I want to come back to you on that, but I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to speak. So thank you, Krista. I'll come back to you.
Okay.
So Kent, next up. Sorry, I mispronounced Gaik Bimio Kito B. So you, I, and Floyd are from the same area of Canada, right? The Great Plains of North America, or as some people call it, the prairies. In fact, Blackfoot and the Plains Cree were somewhat related linguistically, and sometimes in ceremonies I feel I almost understand Blackfoot. But we're related in so many ways, but yet at the same time we're very different. So I was thinking, like the land that Krista grew up in Rankin Inlet, and and us on the prairies, there's very few trees, perhaps. Maybe in the valleys there's trees, but I guess what I was trying to think of, the prairies, the plains, like the Arctic, when I've been talking to people from outside those areas, and I say I'm from Saskatchewan or from the prairies, they think, oh my God, such a boring place. It's flat. When you drive through, you just want to get from here to Vancouver as fast as you can, or going in the opposite direction. And so, but to you, I, and Floyd, or even to Krista, our homelands, they may look flat, but they are far from boring, They just are full of life. And it is in this country, in this land, that the Blackfeet, the Plains Cree, and so many other Plains tribes develop such very, very complex ways of life. And in fact, when we think about it, our cultures are often emulated by outside folks, whether it's in art or in film, right? You always see in these shows how we seem to be at the wrong end of the stick, but at least they're thinking about us. But it's our way of life, and this is what I was hoping that we may. And the first question I want to ask you, in Plains Cree, and I want to have Floyd talk about this in a few minutes. Plains Cree, they call it Bimitsuun. And in Blackfoot, you have a similar concept, this way of life. Kipa tapio sinu. Kipa tapio sinu. Could you talk about this concept, this idea, this way of life, just as an introduction to a number of questions I want to ask you?
Okay. Okay. Nistorna go kai tsipamyo kitopi. Na sa utskap ni tsinkika ka kinitsitsbinka sam kai tsipamyo kitopi. Okay, kitknak sam tsimpoa ka ksichikoika kiokistoa vammochtse ksiskanatan. Nitomchtitapimiksaikski nitomchtu annum Siksika. Hello, we're always encouraged to introduce ourselves as who we are. Our older people and our Blackfoot language speakers, they always tell us to introduce us who we are first as a Blackfoot person. And in my language, I expressed who I am. And I mentioned that my late grandfather, Arthur Youngman Sr., he was the one who named me in my adult years, I guess. When I was born, my grandmother on my father's side, Rosaria Redgun, she called me Utakyapini from birth. So I've been Utakyapini from birth until 18 years old. And Utakyapini, it means light eyes. On my dad's side, they have light eyes. Well, my grandpa, Arthur Utskapini, is referring to as his eyes as well. So they have a very descriptive language. And kipata piuchsinon, that term is talking about who we are as Blackfoot people. And that's our way of life. In the English language, when we talk about culture, my culture, the culture of the Blackfoot people, that term culture in English language, it's very loose-fitting. It's a loose-fitting term. And I always share, every time I talk, I always share, I Googled it one time, the term culture. And when it brought up definitions, bacteria was one definition of culture. But the definition I always share is, well, there was Webster's, but dictionary.com.
Yeah.
And in that, the definition of culture talked about the sums of attitudes, customs, and beliefs that distinguishes one group of people from another. Culture is transmitted through language, material objects, ritual, institutions, and art from one generation to the next. And I thought about it, and that's Kipatapisin. Kipatapisin is our way of life, who we are, our connection to this place. Going right to the beginning of time for the Blackfoot people, it's explained through our Akaitapitsin exists. Akaitapitsin is, in English again too, I'll say stories. Or Akaitapitsin, old time stories, or story. Really what it is, it's stories from the ancient times of the Blackfoot people. And the thing about these stories, they were talked about throughout the millennia, going back thousands of years. And the reason why I say thousands of years, because I've worked with archaeologists, and the artifacts or stuff that they dig up in their square units, they radiocarbon date them, and they go back far over 10,000 years, going back to the original Clovis point, that, you know, term, the archaeology. But anyways, you know, that's, and a lot of our stories, our explanation of how everything came to be, it's explained, and it's all about survival. It's all about surviving in this place. So it's a tough place to live in, the Bald Prairies, but there's many valleys throughout Blackfoot country. So with the natural world, everything above us, the cosmos, the climate, the birds, the animals, the plants, the roots, waters, wells, rivers, lakes, everything, our people had an intimate relationship, a unique kinship with everything around us. And throughout time, all these gave our people a way of life, how to survive in this place. And throughout the seasons, we were given many different our sacred bundles that belong to the Blackfoot people. They're all part of this place. So that's known as this, pretty much just living, simply living everything what we're taught. And this definition, when it talks about language, first of all, and our old people always say that our language is very important, because there's so much explanation in one word. There's so much teaching in one word. And that is part of everything. And the original language of this place is the Blackfoot language and everything around this place. So then this definition talks about material objects. Well, what are the material objects? There are our bundles, our sacred bundles. And there's many different types of sacred belongings that our people were given, going right back from the beginning of time, and how our people were taught to live in this place. And then there's a ritual. In order to take care of our sacred belongings, our sacred items, I'll use my language, a person goes through a ritual to take care of them. They don't know, not just anybody hangs on to these things. There's a process, and there's a ceremonial transfer that takes place. And that ceremonial transfer, it's still intact, right back to when these things were given to our people. We still call on the people the names of these things that were given to us. And then institutions. Well, everywhere around us is our institution. Right now, I'm sitting in my kitchen. You must have thought I'm sitting outside.
Yeah, like me.
Yeah. Now, right now, I'm sitting in my kitchen, and I'm disconnected from the natural world, from my environment. If we had this group sitting here in the backyard at my place, well, you're gonna hear the birds, you're gonna see the animals. Those are the things that help teach our history as Blackfoot people. The grass, the different types of grasses that are around us as we sit there. The sun will set, the stars will come out. Well, now we'll start talking about the different constellations and how they came to be. It's all explained in our stories. So the institutions all around us, sitting under a tree, sitting by a well, sitting by the lake, river, everywhere it's going to teach us something. And art, this, you know, the art of my people is so beautiful.
Mhm.
And right from our homes to our clothing, to our headwear, to our sacred bundles, everything is beautiful. With the going way back, the quill work, and then with the trade goods, the glass seed beads, pony beads, hog bells, you know, we evolve. Look, I'm wearing my area shirt today. It looks fancy. Whereas being in 150 years ago, I'll be wearing my nicest weasel tail suit right now, because our people are proud, you know. In big meetings, when we come together, important gatherings, they dress with what they have. So art, it's all part of that explanation to the symbols, and like with the dresses, and you know, many different things. I shared some pictures, Nicholas. I think it was the third picture I sent. If you want to share that, if you're able to. Yes, so this one here, we're at the Glenbow Museum, and I've worked at our Old Sun Community College, and we've developed Siksika knowledge courses, and we always do our best to have language incorporated into these programs. And this one here, we're looking at the Blackfoot woman's dress. So we brought some of our Blackfoot language speakers to come in and, you know, talk to the younger students. We always, like I said, so we could try to have that that language there. And these styles of dresses have gone, I don't want to say have gone away, but our people have kind of, how do you say it? It's gone down. And I'm always encouraging my community here for the ladies to create these types of dresses. 2 years ago, we went to the Smithsonian, and it blew me away that they had about 9 of these dresses collected from the Blackfoot people. And old, some of them turn of the century, that's how old. The late 1800s, the early 1900s, these styles of dresses were collected way back then. And you know, my involvement with museums, going into the different collections all over, it blows me away, and what had been collected from the Blackfoot people. Siksika were one of the 4 tribes amongst the Siksika. There's Kaina, Pikani, and Amskapi, Pikani. There's 4 tribes amongst the Blackfoot Confederacy. And, you know, we share the same language, we share the same ceremonial ways. So keep at that, you know, like these dresses that you see, there's so much meaning to them too, and how they were given to us. The stories are still being shared on how this style of beadwork and how everything's put together goes back to Ksistikum, the thunder. Our people have which are the thunder medicine pipes, and these are associated with that. So, and that goes back a long time.
That was something that I was very interested in your thinking about that, because so many of and you've been to museums around the world, and even one locally with the Glenbow, and a lot of the cultural belongings which were taken from the communities, you know. So when you're interested in wishing that the continuity of the dresses would continue, what you said was interesting, that the knowledge is still there. The songs, the stories, all of that is still there, which is really critical. And I think the language is also very helpful to that, in understanding that, isn't it? And I'm wondering if you what your thoughts about, and you know, when you have people like that gathered around, and I notice our cousin Vivian is there in the picture too, that language must play an important part as you're standing there talking about these things, right? These ancestral belongings. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, that one there is they're standing there, they're talking about Mestohpataki. Well, not Mestohpataki. They're referring to Mesto, which is the crow. Mesto, or Mesto, it's referring to when the crow spread his wings to bring the cold weather from the north. So right there, like the name of that style of dress, it's embedded in the language.
Mm.
There's other components on the lower part too that have different terminology for it as well, eh? And have these people present, well, are these people, I'm referring to the Blackfoot language speakers, having them join while we go and view these items in the museums. They're able to provide that Blackfoot context, eh?
Okay. Thank you, Kent. I'm going to come back to you. I've got a lot of questions because I know you and I are just beginning to know each other, and I think people would like to know more of what you have to say, but for the sake of time, I have to switch over to my Cree friend here, Floyd. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kent. Merci, Floyd. Okay, so we've long known each other, not in childhood, but certainly in our older period here. And Floyd, you've been very, not only a phenomenal person to me, a good friend, but also a scholar that really has helped me look and see the world differently by incorporating the Cree language into my thinking, into my writing. And in fact, you helped me a lot in discovering the name, a new way of thinking about this idea of Kāmawāpātahmōwin, you know, a new way of seeing the world. So I wanted to thank you for that. And it's really the basis for the discussion of what we're talking about today and through this series. So, but I wanted to talk to you about what Kent said earlier about the Blackfoot way of life that he called it in Cree, it's Bimatsuan. And I'm wondering, to me, this idea of Bimatsuan forms the core of your thinking. And I think when you and I talked about it, that everything our thinking begins from the Sundance and begins from Indigenous philosophy or Cree philosophy in this case, but this Bimatsuan, this way of living. And I'm wondering if you would explain it, and is it a core of what you do and how you see the world and your work?
Oh yes. So before I address that topic,
yep,
you mentioned my name, Morning Traveler. Kiskawakute. It refers to the sun traveling through the day, or day traveler. So it's another way to say sun, like my name. And it's Indigenous way, Cree way. That one, that being the sun, Ilkwe, that's the one, he's your relative now, the one you're named after. So that's the Cree worldview, like that's the beginnings of it. They say that name, it's like your registration. Nowadays you register with Indigenous services, but in the old ways, with your name, you're registered to creation. And then now creation, they know you, they see you, you're a part of it, and now you become a part of it. Because we believe everything has a spirit, has energy. And I think with that in even the term of Great Spirit, they say Great Spirit is not a man, they said. He is three. He's a man, woman, and son. So he's a family. And so they say the family, that's the basis of the universe. They say everything is a family, even the sun is a family. Say, you too now on earth, you're a family. You are in a relationship with each other. But that idea of a Great Spirit being three, that was taken away during the residential schools, because they didn't want us to have this multi-dimensional worldview. They didn't like that. They wanted us to be like them, unidimensional. So previous to that, we had a multi-dimensional worldview, sort of like a quantum worldview, you could say. Even an atomic worldview. Because then what is the relationship between Great Spirit, three, and the atomic theory of three? Proton, neutron, electron, which is the foundation of life, right? And they say that Great Spirit's everywhere. So, but so is atoms. So that's what is the relationship there with that idea, and that's the basis of the tripod teepee. When you make a teepee, it's a tripod. They say that's what that means. A Great Spirit and his family. They are one family. So they were, because we don't have he and she in our language. So we didn't have he and she, like we didn't say he, a Great Spirit, we didn't say that. We didn't have he. So that's another way of already when you're growing up, you're learning language, you perceive things like that already before you go to school. And then when you go to school, that is changed now.
I know. I remember when we were growing up, we used to just say he all the time, and the teachers would correct us. No, that's a girl. You know, it's a she.
Yes. Many people still have that problem when they're rushed or
Yeah.
not thinking. They'll call a man a she and a woman a he.
Yeah.
To this day, it's like that. And so that's just the introduction. Now people know my name, like introducing myself. And then I come from Broken Knife, Kiskikoman. In our language, we don't call this reserve pound maker. We call this Kiskikoman, Broken Knife, after a Sarsi warrior. It's named after a hill, so a geographical area. So already there, most reserves, they were located they picked that place, but it already had a geographical name. So to this day, they still call that in that language. Like in our language, we don't say Little Pine Reserve, which is next door. We say Waskituse, which means that it's a shape of a hill. Waskituse, like a hip bone hill, and you could say. And then
where I'm from, it used to be called Red Pheasant. Right.
Eagle Hills.
Eagle Hills, yeah.
Because that's where you guys are located. So yeah, it had to do with placement in the universe, where they kept that name even after a reserve was put there, because the reserve was like a colonial construct, right? It's like a post-treaty construct. So Biennale, making a living. That's what that means. Through beginning, through action. Mate, it has the word mate in the Biennale, to begin, to have effort, to initiate. So I guess that was the beginning of their worldview. Like that means to make a living. It's very close to the word Bimatsuwin, which means life. But Bimatsuwin, to make a living, to make an effort, a way of life. That's what that is. It's through effort, through action. That's the meaning of that word. If you break it down, matse, begin, bimatse. So also the word life has that word, that beginning too. So it's action oriented. So that informed their worldview. That informed how you should live in this life, what you must do. So it's a way of action. Life is a way of action. So much so that when you die, or not when you die, when you leave this earth, when your spirit leaves this earth. Another way to say it is
Yeah.
stop moving.
Stop moving.
Yeah, that's to do with this earthly plane.
Yeah.
They stop moving, your blood cells, your eyes, your cells stop moving. So it becomes inert. There, that's another way to say that, but that's more like an earthly term. The spiritual term is which is like his spirit left. So took off, you could say. The spirit took off. That's another way. So that's how much the idea of action and effort, it's ingrained already in the words. So when you learn those words, already you'll know that's what you're supposed to do, and that you have to make an effort. So much so that I remember when I was going to school in Europe, when I was a young man, I come back and I was visiting him in the north, and I kind of laid down in the afternoon, and he said, what's wrong? Are you sick? I said, no. He said, only babies and old people lay down in the day. So that's what he said. So you're a young man, you have to stay awake all day. You have to be in movement, effort, activity. So that was how much in his worldview, my uncle, who was a hunter, trapper, bus driver, everything. It was ingrained into him. It's a way of action, a way of movement, and a way of life. So that's what that word you were talking about, bimatahewin.
Yeah, I used another, I guess I used the other one, bimatsuan, instead of bimatsu.
When you use your, but they're very similar, that's okay.
Yeah.
Now, moderator, can you give me the picture of a sign language?
Yeah, let's go to that first picture, because I wanted to ask this question, because since we're talking about language, and I was thinking about and Kent similarly, who is a Plains from the Plains. It used to be in the old days when tribes were in movement and constant movement would come together at a particular time of the year to trade, right? Trading all sorts of material goods, and but because there were dozens and dozens of tribes, they all couldn't speak the same. So you had to figure out a way to communicate, and sign language was one of them. And I know that you and I have been talking about this, and I know that in the summertime you have these workshops on sign language, and I'm just wondering how did you come across this idea to think about using sign language in the study of language and in theater and all the work that you do?
First of all, the language, your indigenous language, it informs your sentence structure and how you construct images and actions. As theater, it's important because theater is about visual language and a narrative language. So I thought, if you're going to do indigenous theater, you must reflect, your indigenous performance must reflect your worldview. So I thought sign language, it follows indigenous worldview because in our Cree language, sentence structure is fluid. the words can be in any order and it still makes sense. So that's the best way to learn Indigenous languages, through sign. So like I see you, good. I like, makes me feel good. Three signs says a lot.
Mhm.
But if you were to compose it in English, it would mean good. I see you, warm, nice heart. Why can't we write a sentence like that? You know? But if you write a sentence like that, the dramaturg will say, that sentence doesn't make sense. And you would say, in Cree it does. It makes sense. So that's how we say it. That's how we say it, verbally and physically. So with sign language, we are reviving it in our area. I know other tribes, probably Kent's people, they still use the sign. So to eat, mitsa, miasin, work together, friend, together, join up. So right now, all of us, we're talking about big square, all together for something ahead, good. So that's sign, that's Indigenous internal language image making structure to try to communicate. But in the English, it's bad grammar, you're missing a lot of words. But for us, it makes sense. So every late summer, we have sign language seminars. We're having one July 18th to 21st here on Palmaker. We're reviving it. In the writing, I say I'm a cultural theorist. Sometimes I write drama or poems or essays. In my last essay, I'm not an academic, and I thought I shouldn't try write like an academic. I should write in my trade. My trade is performing arts, and I come from Indigenous worldview. So, moderator, can you put up my text? So this was, I introduced my text because one of the principles of Indigenous storytelling, which is the basis of theater, is you always introduce yourself first. You intro. How, my name is Morning Traveler. I was born in the moon when the choke cherries are ripe, and I grew up within my language, surrounded by the tales of the old. I went to school in nearby towns. In winters, our bus would be greeted by the dull explosions against our windows, white snowballs fashioned by hateful hands. I did not know that such a beautiful thing as being an Indian could also be such a terrible thing. And I studied theater, and I have traveled the world, talked with many wise ones and many foolish, counting coup in many enemy lands. I guess that was for myself an experiment research of, well, how does my worldview and sentence structure, ways of introduction start to impact my contemporary practice? So that was one of my researches, and it still is. To this day, I don't write anymore in a pseudo-academic style. I try to write that reflects my worldview. So it could be, maybe somebody would say, he's kind of simple. He writes like a child, or he has short little sentences. Maybe he's dyslexic, or maybe those kind of things could happen, you know, but no, it's reflecting my worldview. Indigenous performance, I consider it an artistic genre that goes beyond colonial labels of identity. In fact, I would say the term Indigenous to refer to categories is an obsolete category. It's dead. It's a colonial category. And we're not yet in a post-colonial visioning stage yet. One of the foundations of the method I've been creating is the Lakota winter count, Wanyetu Wohapi, how they compose images, narrative images to talk about a year. So using the principles of this becomes a foundation of acting technique and text analysis technique. The other one is gesture and sign which is a reflection of how we are composing our internal montage system to communicate. So that's the other ways. That's what you talk, you sign and gesture. That's what you're approaching is. And, can you go to the next image? I'm trying to be quick now. I don't take too much time. Moderator, my picture of my set. That's one set I made. It's a large teepee with red concrete and steel poles, and that's a performing set. And that's my colleague Sabina. She's a Polish Bengali dancer. Because like I said, Indigenous performance is artistic genre. It's distinguished by its indigenous methods, but it's transcendent and transcultural. Next image, moderator. I have another image of a stage.
There.
This one. I'm building this at my home, at my culture site. It's based on a Hidatsa earth lodge structure. It has 12 poles and 4 interior poles to support the structure. And the walls will be covered in canvas. And there's a star, a cross cut into the top to let in light. The cross represents the morning star. And so I believe it's my proposition, my research that indigenous performance education, to educate, it must take place within your own indigenous structures, because those indigenous structures represent your worldview. They're manifestations of your brain. Some would even say manifestations of the Great Spirit's brain. So those are what those buildings are. And when you go in, you start to view the world, you understand the world in a different way based on how that building is structured. And that's view. So language informs worldview according to the themes. I try it, I do it. That was my challenge to myself about 10 years ago. I thought, it's nice to have ideas. I thought, it's nice to be a theoretician, but it's even better to do it, I thought. And
Yeah.
so
I'm really excited about this kind of looking at an ancient structure, but in a very contemporary way, and that it acts as both as a theater space and I guess a ceremonial space. And I think that probably how those in the old days, the same space acted in many different ways, you know?
The same. And because the foundation of Indigenous performance is storytelling.
Yep.
Which has narrative, action, space, light, and takes place in a specialized or sacred space. And the narrative is informed by winter count, ways of composing images, and sign and gesture to express. And because storytelling, in order to create a theory, you got to break it down into its components, so it's teachable. And so this is what my research I've been doing for the last half dozen to 10 years. When I decided, I think I'm going to formulate it. I'm going to try. So that's what I've been doing. And so with that, I'll sign off here, Gerald. I don't want to take too much time.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. I listened to everybody else before me. And Mia Sin, it's good. I heard good things.
Yes. Yep. Amy Austin.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can entertain questions from our audience, and I'll just hang in there and just wait for the questions to come in. In the meantime, I want to ask to go back to Krista, and you heard both Kent and Floyd give really good, solid examples of the poetics of language and how difficult it is to translate from one to the other because you miss so much in the translation, right? And So I'm wondering if you can give us some examples of how Inuit conceptualize or see the world differently. So, and if you could tie that in, maybe it's part of your research, I'm not sure, but if you can give us some one or two examples, that'd be good.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great listening to Floyd and Kent. I wanted to echo some of what Floyd said about, like description, land description. A lot of our land description, our land is named descriptively, right? And a lot of the names are reused across the Arctic. There was once when I was a little girl, I was learning about Nuleayuk, and you might know her as her colonizer name, Sedna. I was learning about her, and the story goes that she was banished to this island called Qikiktak. And I remember running home and being excited. I was probably less than 10 years old and telling my parents, I know where Nuleayuk was when she was banished in the story. It's one of our creation stories that my parents were like, oh yeah, that's great. Where? And I said, at Qikiktak, which is the island outside our community. And I remember being so excited that this is where this creation story happened. It was just outside town, sort of thing. And now that I look back, I think, oh geez, my parents must have thought I was so like innocent or so cute. I hope they thought I was cute about it, but
they still do.
But also echoing what Floyd was saying about the fluidity of language, in Inuktitut, it's like these building blocks, and you could arrange the pieces, like Lego pieces, in different ways, and it would still make sense. And a lot of our language is condensed. So when you see translations, it's often way shorter than the English text. But so, that's one of the things I love about it. But, going back to your question, how do we conceptualize the world through our language? I think the example I want to share has to do with names and naming, and because that's part of everything in our lives. And more specifically, what we call Tokluragnik, which means it's relationships or relationality. It's the terms you use in relation to someone else, like mother and father and that sort of thing. But it goes beyond that. It affects who you, where you are in the world. It situates you. So, and it, that's the power of your name, where our names are not gendered, and the meaning of names is not so important than who you're named after. And that's where the Tokluragnik comes into place. So I'm named after a man, and when I was given the name, I inherited his relationships as well. So our relationships are not just familial, they're based on names as well. So our naming system is very multi-tiered, and that affects our language and where we're situated in the world. I'm named after this man, and therefore his son, Titi, I treated him like he was my son, even though he was an old man, and he called me father. And so we had that relationship, this Tokluragnik. But there's also a lot of our relationship names are very specific, right? So we have like mother's sister or father's sister. They're both our aunts, but they have different terms, and we treat them accordingly. And I think by simplifying them, by adopting, English terms for Tokluragnik, really takes away from those relationship opportunities and those relationship buildings and building and that, that relationship overall, because you treat different people differently based on the Tokluragnik. And for example, for a woman, her brother is called Anik, but all of her male cousins are also Anik. So you treat them accordingly, like your brother. And for a man, your sister is Naya, and all your girl cousins are Naya. So you treat them all like sisters. And then there's, depending on where you are in the family, you're either an older sibling or younger sibling. So there, you know, that I think that is the best example I can think of how language and the nuances of it, because it's really complex. You have to learn these things for a long time. It took me a long time to learn all of this. Really helps you, or helps us conceptualize our world in an Inuk way.
Mm. Mm. Thank you. Thank you. That was very interesting. I mean, this is a question for you all because we're talking about art and language and way of life. And each of you have been to museums, yeah? And museum collections and the recovery and restitution and reinvigorating as we go to museum collections. But part of that visitation and part of working in the museums, you learn the language, the Western languages of English and French or German, Italian, and they have their own way of seeing the world. And often that's how we see the world. We look at our ancestral works, our belongings, and we start to think of them like that. For example, when we see, well, we picked up and Kent gave a good example of, I'll never see culture the same way because I'll start looking and wanting yogurt now every time I hear that word, you know. But the other thing is, the other kind of words that is often being used is this idea of object, yes? And that to me is a extremely difficult word because, you know, we use it a lot and we use it wrongly. As Indigenous peoples, obviously it's not something we use, because if we use that term, our whole way of looking at our ancestral belongings would be different. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, when I was working at the Smithsonian, I was witness to a repatriation ceremony. And these folks from Alaska came and they were to come and pick up their ancestral belongings. There was a mask and something else. And the museum people came out with a little trolley and brought out these masks. They had their white gloves on, of course, which they should have. And they brought it out and they handed it over to the I think they were Tlingit. And this man picked up with his bare hands, he picked up the mask and he started speaking to it. And he said something to the following. He said, you know, it's so nice to see you again. We're going to be taking you home now. You know, at that point, it made sense to me that he was using that Indigenous perspective where you don't treat things like that as objects, but you treat them like they're part of your community. They are subjects, yeah? You never speak of things in the third person. And so this whole concept of languages and how Indigenous peoples view it differently is really what interests me, and I think it interested people that we're thinking about. So Kent, I'm just wondering if you have a similar view to that, about these kinds of words that we use, and when you go to museums, when you go with some of the Blackfeet and you're looking at this material, what's that kind of relationship that people have, you have when you go to the museum?
Yeah. In our, amongst the Blackfoot people, they've been repatriating our ceremonial items going back to the late 80s and picked up in the 90s. And the reason for that is because our ceremonial ways have always been there. And within each community, each tribe of the Blackfoot people, we were all on different levels of how impacted our people were through colonization and those residential schools that our parents and grandparents went through. So yeah, I always talk about there's that dark era that our people had to endure. And 1966 here in Siksika, that's when well, historically here in Canada, our people became Canadian citizens, and alcoholism really impacted our community. So when these items were being collected, it was because of our people being told that our way is wrong. But there was I always talk about a handful of people here in my community that kept it going. And when they started to go into the collections with the old folks that were still around at the time, they would say stuff like, when they would visit a collection that had drawers full of our sacred bundles, they would say stuff like "Tawah Sato," letting them know that they're there to visit, and listening to them talk about their experiences back in the 90s. They said the old folks, they would talk to them, it's like what you're explaining too, like they would talk to them to let them know that our way at home, our people are wanting them to come back, and in their way to help assist spiritually, I guess, to work with the folks that hold on to these collections, that they'll be able to come back into our communities. So I consider myself the second generation of people who worked with repatriation amongst the Blackfoot people. The group before me paved the way to bring a lot of our ceremonial items home. And amongst the Blackfoot, we have we have in English, they say sacred societies, a group of comrades. And those items that we use today come out, and we use them at our agugats, and our sacred circle camp. I think the common term in the English language they use is Sundance, but in our language we refer to it as agugats. And so with their work that they did to bring back the items, we're able to have our camps. This picture that I use as my background was taken in the 30s, early 30s. There was an anthropologist and a psychologist, Lucien Hanks and Jane Richardson. They came and they really documented the social behavior of our people, and they took a lot of photos. So we have this camp back here in our community, and just my involvement going out to the different collections, listening to the folks that we bring along, how they talk to them. It's similar to what you're talking about, these folks that you witnessed, how they talk to those items, because they have energies, they're alive. But when they end up in the collections, they kind of, they're I don't know what the best way to say it, I guess, they're kind of resting, I guess, So when they come home, there's ceremonies that take place to call the spirit back to these items, that they're home, and that they could serve their purpose, what they're intended for.
They're looking for their family. They're looking for the language of communication, I think. Yeah. Thank you. I think I'm going to ask Floyd the last question. And it has to do with that perhaps gets to the core of what we've been talking about today. And it is in the research you did, I think, in looking at the Latvian filmmaker, Sergei Eisenstein, I think is his name.
Yeah.
Who was talking about Japanese theater. Do you remember that? We were talking about that?
Yes.
And you were telling me that story. So could you tell me that story and wrap it in what we've been talking about and just how it's influenced perhaps your thinking and the kind of things we're talking about here? Yeah.
The Russian Latvian filmmaker, he wrote a book called Montage, Film Montage. And in there's a chapter called The Japanese Ideogram in Cinema. This was before the word became kanji, the way of Japanese writing. But anyways, his question was, why do the Japanese try and make films like Americans? Because already they have their own image making montage system. So shouldn't they be making cinema based on their own montage and image making systems that are inherent in their language? So I thought that was one of the foundations of my research, was that idea, that notion. That's why I started researching winter count, Wanyitu Hapi, and sign and gesture. The other one was Tadashi Suzuki, who said, he said, it looks funny, he said, to have Japanese actor acting in an American play. He said, acting like Americans, the social scene of Americans. Shouldn't they be doing something that comes from their culture, how they use their bodies? So that was the other influence. So with keeping it short, Gerald, that's what you're responding what you asked me.
Thank you. Because I think it's really an interesting point that when we think of the art, certainly of Asian and my travels there, is emulating the other, yeah? And it could be considered appropriation, but oftentimes it's just, it's both emulating the other, but also taking some ideas for yourself to do something else. But I think what interests me at this point is really going back to the beginning of, as you say, to our own communities, our own language, our own culture, and maybe begin from there once again, you know, because I think we have enough within our cultures to not just to influence, but to have an impact and a contribution to the world of art, to the world of culture. And certainly here in Canada, maybe even Australia as well, there can be tremendous influences of ways of seeing and ways of talking, ways of knowing. And I think it's behooves our institutions in our respective countries to begin thinking seriously about these other ways of knowing and these other ways of seeing and introduce them more, because, you know, colonial countries need to start thinking about the Indigenous viewpoints, right? And contributions. And in fact, living in those spaces, and what each of you have been talking about is so critical to understanding the land, because, you know, let's face it, our culture, our language is all based on the land. And each of us, from wherever we are in Canada, we see that world differently. And I think that's a contribution that we can have to an intellectual tradition that can only grow from here. So that's one of my closing thoughts. But I wanted to leave because I thought there was something really interesting from, I assume it's one of our listeners from Australia. who says, and I'm going to give him the final word here. His name is Roger Harold Benjamin. And he says, to hear Floyd and Kent and Krista speaking their birth languages here in where it disappeared. Oh no, what happened to it?
I don't know.
I was
trying to
reading
answer.
it. I was reading it and it disappeared because here
I was trying to
yeah,
answer.
here it is. Here it is. To hear Floyd, Kent, and Krista speaking their birth languages here in Sydney is a huge privilege. And to hear your explanations of how language can or cannot be translated and affects conceptions of the world have been precious. Thank you very much. I think that I agree with them. So thank you, Mr. Benjamin. And I want to thank you all once again. Krista, thank you very much. And Floyd and Kent, thank you very much for joining us today. I know it's been a long day and we've been all very excited to hear you. And so I want to say to everybody, this concludes this series. And thank you again for joining us for the second series. This is the second of 4, hosted by the Power Institute in partnership with the Wapatah Centre for Indigenous Visual Knowledge. And to reiterate what Mark said at the beginning, I'd like to certainly express my gratitude to the Terra Foundation for much of the funding. So in our next events, our next series, please follow us, either the Wapatah Centre social media accounts or the Power Institute for more information about our next event, which will be held in September. And this time I will be in Sydney, Australia, and where we can pick up the Australian perspectives on this very interesting topic of Kāmawāpātahmōwin Indigenous Visual Knowledge series. So we look forward to seeing you again, and hopefully you'll be joining us from Canada when we broadcast from Australia. So thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate your time and your effort and your knowledge, your expertise. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.